Hello and good morning. I'm your part-time teacher, Sir Shekana. Well, the outgoing standard 8 learners, in our today's lesson, Science and Technology, we'll discuss or we'll revise the plants. Okay? We will revise the plants. You remember in standard 7, you learned that plants are classified into two major groups. Plants are classified into two major groups: the flowering plants and the non-flowering plants. Plants are classified into two major groups, and these are the flowering plants and the non-flowering plants. What are flowering plants? The flowering plants are the plants which produce flowers. Flowering plants are plants which produce flowers, while non-flowering plants are the plants which do not produce flowers. Flowering plants are the plants that produce flowers, while the non-flowering plants are the plants which do not produce flowers. Flowering plants produce flowers. Non-flowering plants do not produce flowers. All right? Flowering plants are those plants which produce flowers. On the other hand, we have got non-flowering plants. The non-flowering plants are those plants which do not produce flowers. All right? Okay. Let's look at the examples of plants which produce flowers. Just a lot of them. Just a lot of them. We can talk of mangoes, tomatoes, lemons, granadillas. They produce flowers. All right? They produce flowers. On the other hand, we have got those plants which do not produce flowers, the non-flowering plants. Examples of non-flowering plants are mushroom. A mushroom is a plant, but have you ever seen a flower of a mushroom? No. So a mushroom does not produce flowers. So because a mushroom does not produce flowers, it is a non-flowering plant. Algae, ndele, ndele, algae do not produce flowers. Moss does not produce flowers. Pine trees do not produce flowers. Lichens, liverworts do not produce flowers. Cedar do not produce flowers. So these examples I've mentioned now are the examples of the non-flowering plants. So let's look at the examples of these. E.g., mushroom, liverworts, lichens, cedars, mods, algae, mosses, and so many examples. We've got a lot of examples of the non-flowering plants. All right? So remember, the non-flowering plants are those plants which do not produce flowers. The non-flowering plants are those plants which do not produce flowers, while the flowering plants are the plants which produce flowers. And the examples of the flowering plants are tomatoes. So we can talk of tomatoes, mangoes, maize, lemons, pumpkins, and so many others. So these are the examples of the flowering plants. So on this side we're having the examples of flowering plants, the plants which produce flowers. While on the other side we're having the examples of plants which do not produce flowers, and these plants are called the non-flowering plants. All right. Okay. Let's talk of the uses of the flowering and non-flowering plants. The uses of the flowering and the non-flowering plants. Uses of flowering and non-flowering plants. The uses of the flowering and the non-flowering plants. What are they? Source of medicine, provision of food, source of furniture, source of raw materials. Huh? So we have got a lot of them. All right. You have to remember this. You have to remember this. Uses of the flowering and the non-flowering plants. Source of food, source of income, source of medicine, source of timber, source of furniture, source of employment, provision of food, source of foreign exchange, forex. All right. So we have got a lot of uses of these flowering and non-flowering plants. I'll just write a few of them. Provision of food, source of medicine, source of income, source of employment. So we have got a lot of uses of these flowering and non-flowering plants. I know by just talking of these four, you've remembered a lot because we're just revising. All right? Thank you. Then you looked at the structure of a flower. All right? The structure of a flower, because in this case we are discussing the flowering plants and the non-flowering plants. So we are talking of a flower. What is a flower? Because we're saying some plants produce flowers while others do not produce flowers. So how does a flower look like? So I have got flowers here. These are flowers, real flowers of a certain plant. So these are flowers, yellow flowers. They're beautiful, right? So the plant which produces flowers is called a flowering plant. But those plants which do not produce flowers are called non-flowering plants. All right? Okay. Let's look at this one. You remember this? You remember this, right? Okay. This is a diagram a drawing of a flower. This is just a drawing of a flower, like this one. Okay? Now, we discussed the parts of a flower. You remember the parts of a flower? Let's start labeling. We have got this one, which is this one, this. What is it? This is what is called petal. This is the petal. Okay? All right. Let's look at this one. What is it? That one is stigma. That is what is called the stigma. Let's look at this one. This one is this one is the anthers. Those ones are anthers. What about this one? This one? Yes, it's called the style. That one is what is called the style. Let's now look at this one. Here, anthers. What about this one? This one is the filament. The filament. And what about this one? This one? This one is called the ovary. These ones which are inside the ovaries are called the ovules. And lastly, we'll talk of this one, which is called the sepal. And not forgetting this one, because they have got a small one. This one is the flower stalk. The flower stalk. Like we talk of leafy stalk. You remember in standard 6, you learned the parts of a leaf. You are talking of the apex, the margin, the midrib, the lamina, the leaf blade. You were talking of the leafy stalk. So this is not a leafy stalk, but it's a flower stalk. All right. Okay. These are the parts of a flower. These ones are the parts of a flower. What about the functions of these parts of a flower? You remember the functions? Do I have to be writing these? I have got a limited space, unfortunately. Anyway, I will try. All right. These are the parts of a flower. These are the parts of a flower. We have labeled the petal, the stigma, the anthers, the filament, the flower stalk, the style, the ovary, the ovules, the sepal, as the parts of the flower. Let's now look at the functions of these parts of a flower. What are the functions of these parts of a flower? What are the functions of these parts of a flower? Let's start by looking at the petal. I have to write petal here. What is the function of the petal? The function of the petal is to attract pollination agents. The function of the petal is to attract pollination agents. To attract pollination agents. To attract pollination agents. The function of the petal is to attract pollination agents. Examples of these pollination agents are bees and birds. Bees and birds. I have to write this. E.g., bees and birds. Butterfly as well. So those are the examples of the pollination agents. Okay, what about the function of the stigma? The function of the stigma is to receive pollen grains from the anthers. To receive pollen grains from the anthers. What do you call that process? Pollination. All right, we'll look at that. Okay, what about the function of the anthers? The function of the anthers is to produce pollen grains. The function of the anthers is to produce pollen grains. The function of the anthers is to produce pollen grains. What about the function of the filament? The function of the filament is to hold the anthers. So the function of the filament is to hold the anthers. Like my hand is holding a marker. So the hand is holding the marker. The function of my hand is to hold the marker at this time around. The same applies to the filament and the anthers. So the function of the filament is to hold the anthers. That one is the function of the filament. So to hold the anthers. All right. Let's now look at the function of the flower stalk anyway. Let's look at the function of this flower stalk. The function of the flower stalk is to connect the flower to the whole plant. All right. So flower stalk. So the flower stalk connects the flower to the plant. The function of the flower stalk is to connect the flower to the plant. Let's now look at the function of the style. The function of the style is to connect the stigma to the ovaries. So, style, the function of the style is to connect the stigma to the ovary. The function of the flower stalk, the style, is to connect the stigma to the ovary. All right. Let's look at the ovules. The function of the ovules. The function of the ovules is to develop into seeds. Okay. After fertilization, the ovules develop into seeds. I'll have an explanation on that. So the function of the ovules is to develop into seeds. To develop into seeds. What about the function of the ovary? I skipped ovary, all right. The function of the ovary. So the ovules are here inside of the ovary. So the ovary. What about the function of the ovary? The function of the ovary is to hold the ovules. And again, the function of the ovary is to develop into a fruit. So the ovary has got two functions: to hold the ovules, to contain the ovules, and to develop into a fruit. Okay, so to hold the ovules and to develop into fruit. All right, what I mean here is that I have got a fruit. This is a fruit, and this fruit came from a flower. Now, what we are seeing here is the fruit. This fruit was once an ovary. So the ovary, after fertilization, develops into a fruit, while the ovules develop into seeds. I have to cut this one. While the ovules develop into seeds. You see, it's a tomato with seeds inside. These seeds you see here were once ovules. So the seeds come from ovules. So here we are seeing two things. We are seeing the fruit itself and the seeds inside. So the seed comes from the ovary, while the fruit, the seed, the fruit comes from the ovary. The fruit comes from the ovary, while the seeds inside come from the ovules. So we have to have the ovules to have seeds, and we have to have the ovary to have the fruit. Thank you. These are the parts of a flower. This is the drawing of a flower, and here we have got the functions of the parts of a flower. All right, this is the petal, and the function of the petal is to attract pollination agents. Chomwe chimachitika ndicho kuti njuchi kaya ndi butterfly gulugufe kaya ndi mbalame imalionera patali duwa kuti apo pali duwa la pinki, apo pali duwa la yellow kaya ndi la white. Zimaonera patali chifukwa chani? Zimaona this thing, the petal. All right, so that is the function of the petal. I have got the stigma right here inside. I have got the anthers right here. Unfortunately, you can't see because of light. So those are the parts of a flower. Okay. Now we have mentioned something about pollination, because we have said the petal attracts pollination agents. We have also talked of anthers produce pollen grains, and the stigma receives pollen grains from the anthers. Definitely, these things are leading us into our next topic, which is pollination and seed dispersal. All right, let's just combine these. What is pollination? Pollination means the transfer of pollen grains from the anthers to the stigma. Pollination means the transfer of pollen grains from the anthers to the stigma. That is what is called pollination. The anthers produce pollen grains. The transfer of pollen grains from the anthers to the stigma is what is called pollination. You understand, right? The pollen grains, the pollen is produced from the anthers. The pollen grains are produced by the anthers here. The pollen grains are found in the anthers here because it is where they are produced. Now, the transfer of the pollen grains from the anthers to the stigma is what is called pollination. Pollen grains can be transferred from the anthers to the stigma in a number of ways. Can be transferred from the anthers to the stigma by water, can be transferred from the anthers to the stigma by wind, can be transferred from the anthers to the stigma by birds, can be transferred from the anthers to the stigma by bees, can be transferred from the anthers to the stigma by butterflies. Now, these things I've mentioned are what are called pollination agents. These things I've mentioned, which help the transfer of pollen grains from the anthers to the stigma, are what are called pollination agents. So, I have to put these things in writing. Pollination. What is pollination? Pollination means the transfer of pollen grains from the anthers to the stigma. Pollination means the transfer of pollen grains from the anthers to the stigma. Okay? The transfer of pollen grains from the anthers to the stigma is what is called pollination. All right. We have got two types of pollination. We have got self-pollination and cross-pollination. We have got self-pollination and cross-pollination. I know you remember. What is self-pollination? Self-pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the anthers of a flower to the stigma of the same flower or another flower but on the same tree. That is what is called self-pollination. Self-pollination means the transfer of pollen grains from the anthers of a flower to the stigma of the same flower or another flower of the same tree. On the other hand, we have got cross-pollination. Cross-pollination means the transfer of pollen grains from the anthers of a flower to the stigma of another flower on a different tree. How I wished I demonstrated this one. Unfortunately, the space is not allowing me. Let me get another chart. All right, the chart is back. Okay, we are saying, oops, the chart is misbehaving. I'm sorry. Let me just use this one. Do this. All right. Now, I was saying When we talk of pollination, cross-pollination means the pollination of, the transfer of pollen grains from the anthers of a flower to a stigma of another flower on a different tree, but of the same species. Okay? What we mean is, we may have a tree here. Another tree here. All right? Now, we have got these two trees. So, what we are saying is, we may have a flower here and another flower on this tree. So, when pollen grains are transferred from the anthers of a flower in this tree to the stigma of a flower on this tree, that one is what is called cross-pollination. But we may have two flowers on the same tree. A flower here, another flower here. Pollen grains can be transferred from the anthers of this flower to the stigma of this flower, which is on the same tree. That one is what is called self-pollination. All right? Thank you. I talked of pollination agents. What are pollination agents? Pollination agents are those things which help in the transfer of pollen grains from the anthers to the stigma. The things that help in the transfer of pollen grains from the anthers to the stigma are what are called pollination agents. All right? So let's look at pollination agents. I hope you see that. I hope you see that. All right. Let's talk of pollination agents. We have got so many examples of pollination agents, and these are: number 1, birds; number 2, water; number 3, bees; number 4, butterflies. Butterflies. So these are some of the examples of agents of pollination. I have to add wind. I have to add wind. So those are the examples of those things which help in the process of pollination. These things are those things which help in the transfer of pollen grains from the anthers to the stigma. The birds, water, bees, butterflies, wind, they are examples of pollination agents. Okay? Let's now look at the difference between the flowers which, the insect pollinated flowers and the wind pollinated flowers. Some flowers are pollinated by wind, while some flowers are pollinated by insects. Insects like bees, butterflies, even birds anyway. But a bird is not an insect. So we'll talk of bees, butterflies, all right? So some flowers are pollinated by wind, and some flowers are pollinated by insects. So how do they differ? What is the difference between the insect pollinated flowers and the wind pollinated flowers? You know them? Okay, let's do them together. So anyway, I have to have a table. I have to draw a table like that. Yes, like this here. So here we have insect pollinated. Insect pollinated flowers. Here we have the wind pollinated flowers. All right, I've got the insects pollinated flowers and the wind pollinated flowers. The first difference between the insect pollinated flowers and the wind pollinated flowers is that the insect pollinated flowers are usually big to be easily seen by the insects, while the wind pollinated flowers are usually small. All right, you see this flower, it is big so that it should be easily seen by the insects, so that it can be easily seen by the insects. So this flower is big. It is big so that it can easily be seen by insects. Ineyo flower hii ndaiona patali kwambiri. Why? Because it is big. All right? So the insect pollinated flowers are usually big or large, all right? Are usually big, while these ones are usually small. Okay? Another difference is that the insect pollinated flowers have got bright petals. Their petals are brightly colored, while the wind pollinated flowers have got dull color. Someone is peeping at me. All right, so have got bright color. The insect pollinated flowers. The wind pollinated flowers have got dull color. All right, that's the difference. So, number one, they are usually big. They are usually small. Number two, brightly colored. Well, these ones, dull colored. Brightly colored. Brightly colored. So that it can easily be seen by insects. While wind pollinated flowers have got a dull color. All right. Another difference is that the insect pollinated flowers produce scent. Kununkila. Have scent, while the wind pollinated flowers do not have scent. All right. Another thing is that the insect pollinated flowers produce nectar. There is a C here. Nectar. While these ones do not produce nectar. Okay? Another thing is that the insect pollinated flowers produce a small quantity of sticky pollen grains. Produce a small quantity of sticky pollen grains. Well, these ones produce large quantity of light pollen grains. Mankanga zimaufa yonje. Ngojigwira tu. Basi ngati zifumbi yo. Why? They are pollinated by wind. So they produce large quantity of light pollen grains. Alright? Pomwe uku, kuma insect pollinated flowers, they produce just a small quantity of pollen grains. Koma timakhala sticky, timakhala tomata. So that when a bee visits the flower, chifukwa bee, njuchi, ikamabwera pa flower, simabwera uzapanga pollination. Bee ikamabwera pa flower, simabwera kuzapanga pollination. Ati ndopita ndikapange pollination, ndikapange transfer the pollen grains from the anthers to the stigma. Bee, njuchi, simadziwa zimenezo yayi. Imapita ku flower to get nectar. This one. A nectar is a certain substance which is very sweet. Kakutsekemera kwambiri. So njuchi imatsatira kamene kaja. So nkati mopita ukatenga nectar, imapezeka zoti mwina yatela pa ma anthers. So chifoti ma anthers aja amapanga produce a small quantity of sticky pollen grains. Timapeza kuti tamata mwina kukaphazi ka njuchi, mwina kukamimba ka njuchi, and then kanjuchi kaja kakuzauluka, kakuzatiranso mwina pachani pa stigma. Katela pa stigma, zupeza zoti katsira pollen grains pa stigma pompaja. You see? So that's what happens. The same applies to you when you visit or when you enter your house with shoes. Umapita panja, mwina ukatenga chakudya, mwina ukatani, wapita panja, kukapangapo china chake. Koma wapita panja paja, mwina kwagwa mvula kuli matope. Pochokera panja paja, upeze kuti kuphazi kwako kapena kunsapato kwako wanyamulako zimatope, kapena wanyamula fumbi. Ukulowa nyumba, fumbi lija ukulisia nyumba mumwe muja. You get the point? That's what happens in pollination. When a bee visits a flower, it visits to get nectar. But in the process, it helps in the process of pollination. You get the point? All right. The last difference between the insect pollinated flowers and the wind pollinated flowers is the way the anthers are held. The anthers of the insect pollinated flowers are firmly held. Amakhala rigid ndithu bwino. While the anthers of the wind pollinated flowers are loosely held. Tepwa. You get the point? All right. So the anthers of the insect pollinated flowers, anthers are firmly held. You're able to see that? While on this side, the anthers are loosely held. Remember, we have discussed the structure of a flower. We've discussed the flowering and non-flowering plants. We've said the flowering plants are the plants which produce flowers. On the other hand, we have got the non-flowering plants, which are the plants which do not produce flowers. We have discussed the examples of flowering plants: tomatoes, mangoes, pawpaw. While on the other hand, we have discussed the examples of the non-flowering plants: lichens, pine tree, liverworts, moss, algae, mushroom. All right, those are the examples of the non-flowering plants, the plants which do not produce flowers. we discussed the uses of the flowering and non-flowering plants. Source of employment, source of income, source of food, source of raw materials, source of furniture, and so many other things. And then we discussed the structure of a flower, whereby we're labeling the parts of a flower, such as the petal, and the function of the petal is to produce